The morning my neighbor called, I discovered my husband had been lying to me. I remember that morning with a clarity that still makes my chest tighten. The sunlight filtered softly through the blinds, dust particles drifting lazily in the warm glow, and I was standing at the kitchen sink, washing last night's dishes. The radio played faintly in the background, but it didn't register. My mind was somewhere else entirely. That's when the phone rang. I don't usually answer calls before my first cup of coffee, but something made me pick it up that day. The voice on the other end was familiar, yet cautious, almost hesitant. It was Mrs. Reynolds, my neighbor, the one who lived just 2 houses down. She had a way of speaking that always sounded like she was balancing on the edge of a secret, and that morning was no different. I think you should know something," she said, her words trembling slightly. I could hear her footsteps moving across her kitchen floor, the faint clatter of dishes in the background, which made the call feel more immediate, more real. I felt a chill creep up my spine. There was no way to prepare for the tension that followed. I gripped the phone a little tighter, my knuckles whitening. My stomach knotted, not with hunger or tiredness, but with a creeping sense of dread. Mrs. Reynolds didn't immediately continue. The pause felt like an eternity. I could hear her take a slow, deliberate breath, the kind someone takes when they're weighing how much of a truth they're ready to share. I saw something," she finally whispered. That simple phrase made my heart stutter. My mind immediately flashed through possibilities, each one darker than the last. I felt my pulse quicken, and a bead of sweat formed at the back of my neck. Even though it was early morning and the sun was just starting to warm the air, I felt a cold dread settle over me, as if the room itself had shifted. I leaned against the counter for support, feeling the smooth, cool marble under my palm, grounding me in the moment even as panic threatened to rise. I asked her, cautiously, "What did you see?" My voice sounded small, fragile, even to me. I tried to steady my breathing, taking slow, shallow inhales, but my thoughts were already racing. The dishes in the sink suddenly felt heavy, weighted with tension. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the wall clock, and yet the world felt oddly suspended, as if everything around me had paused in anticipation of the words about to be spoken. Mrs. Reynolds hesitated again, and I could hear her fidgeting, a subtle scrape of her shoes against the tile. It was those little human noises, the pause in her speech, the movement of her feet, that made the call feel intimate, urgent, and terrifying all at once. I wanted to ask more questions, but I didn't want to push her, not knowing what kind of storm I was about to step into. I glanced toward the bedroom, where my husband was still asleep. The faint rustle of the sheets reminded me of how little he knew, or maybe how much he was hiding. A part of me wanted to run in and shake him awake, demand explanations, but another part urged patience, to listen, to hear the whole truth before reacting. The mix of fear and anticipation was almost paralyzing, and I felt a shiver travel down my spine. Finally, she spoke again, her words deliberate, cautious. "I think you need to check on him. I don't want to say more over the phone." The line went quiet for a moment, and I could hear the faint buzz of her pendant against her necklace as she moved. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and felt an unfamiliar tightness in my chest. That single suggestion, innocent yet loaded, sent a cascade of thoughts tumbling through my mind. I ended the call with a whispered "thank you," barely audible, as if speaking louder might shatter some fragile illusion I had been clinging to. I set the phone down slowly, the corded lines still warm under my fingers. My hands trembled slightly, and I realized that the sun had climbed higher, spilling more light into the kitchen. But it did nothing to warm the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I stood there for several minutes, motionless, listening to the normal morning sounds of my house, the soft hum of the oven warming, the faint drip of the faucet, the distant chirping of birds outside. Everything felt ordinary, yet nothing was as it had been. The sense of safety I had always felt in my home seemed to falter, replaced by an uneasy anticipation I couldn't shake. I thought about my husband again, imagining him in the bedroom, completely unaware, peaceful in his sleep. The contrast between that calm and the storm I felt inside was jarring. My chest tightened, and I found myself pressing my hand against it, grounding myself in the rhythm of my own heartbeat. I wanted to cry, to scream, to run, but I couldn't. All I could do was stand there and breathe, slowly, trying to steady the sudden flood of emotion that had taken over me. Eventually, I moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street. Everything seemed the same. The mailbox, the neatly trimmed lawn, the neighbor's dog trotting across the yard. But I knew it wasn't. Something invisible had shifted, some fundamental part of my life had tilted, and I felt an ache that was both immediate and deep. The sunlight glinted off the leaves, golden and warm, but it felt almost cruel in its normalcy. I sank onto the edge of the counter, letting my hands rest on my knees, staring at the floor. The air smelled faintly of coffee and soap, familiar scents that normally brought comfort, now tinged with unease. My thoughts circled around the call, Mrs. Reynolds' careful words, and my husband's unknowable intentions. I felt dizzy, a mix of adrenaline and fear, the world narrowing to the room around me, the phone on the counter, and the quiet presence of someone I might not fully know anymore. By the time I finally rose to get a cup of coffee, the initial shock had settled into a dull, aching awareness. The morning sun was stronger now, warm on my shoulders, yet I felt nothing but the shadow of uncertainty pressing down. I moved slowly, deliberately, letting each step anchor me, knowing that whatever was coming, I needed to face it with a clear head. And so, I stood there, hands wrapped around the mug, listening to the soft ticking of the clock, letting the quietness of the house hold me, if only for a few moments. The rest of that morning passed in a strange haze. I went through the motions of making breakfast, pouring cereal into a bowl and watching the milk swirl, but my appetite was gone. Every sound in the house seemed amplified. The faint creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, even the soft whistle of wind outside. My hands shook slightly as I stirred my coffee, trying to steady myself. The warmth of the mug was comforting, but it didn't reach the cold knot of dread in my stomach. I found myself glancing toward the bedroom door every few seconds, as if expecting my husband to appear and explain everything, to make it all feel like a misunderstanding. He was still in bed, completely unaware of the storm that had begun in my mind. There was a tightness in my chest, a gnawing anxiety that I couldn't shake. It wasn't just about the phone call. It was about the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Every small detail in the house seemed suddenly charged with meaning. The way he had left his keys on the counter last night, the way the blanket was tossed across the bed, even the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. All of it felt like clues, like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't yet ready to see. I tried to focus on something mundane, running a cloth across the kitchen counters, feeling the smooth surface under my fingers. But the act itself couldn't distract me. I replayed Mrs. Reynolds' words over and over in my mind. "I think you need to check on him." The hesitation in her voice haunted me, and I couldn't stop imagining the worst-case scenario. My stomach churned, my heart raced, and a cold sweat formed on my forehead. The house, usually a place of comfort, felt alien and unsafe. Even the sunlight streaming in through the blinds seemed to mock me, illuminating every ordinary detail while I felt anything but ordinary inside. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Mrs. Reynolds had seen something innocent or misunderstood. But every instinct in me screamed otherwise. I thought about the small changes I had noticed in my husband over the past months. Late nights at work, unexplained absences, the way he sometimes avoided my gaze. At the time, I had dismissed them, telling myself it was stress, fatigue, normal life. Now each detail felt like a red flag I had ignored. I moved through the house almost mechanically, tidying up and checking that everything was in its place. The sound of the vacuum whirring in the background felt like a poor attempt to drown out the tension that was tightening around my chest. Every creak and groan of the house made me start. Every shadow seemed deeper than it should be. I could feel my mind racing, making connections, creating scenarios, each one darker than the last. I paused at the living room window, staring out at the quiet street. The morning sun warmed my face, but it did nothing to ease the weight in my chest. I saw my neighbors going about their routines, oblivious to the internal storm I was experiencing. The normalcy of their lives contrasted sharply with the chaos brewing inside me, making the sense of isolation even more acute. I realized I couldn't share these feelings yet. Not with friends, not with family, not with anyone who might dismiss my fears as paranoia. Every time the bedroom door creaked, I flinched, expecting my husband to emerge, to speak, to deny or explain. But he remained in bed, a figure of calmness and oblivion, and I felt a pang of resentment alongside my anxiety. The distance between us, once subtle, now felt like a canyon I wasn't sure I could cross. I tried to focus on something tangible. My coffee cup, the faint scent of toast, the feel of the rug under my bare feet. But the sensations were hollow, unable to fill the void of unease. By mid-morning, the tension had settled into a steady undercurrent. My body was tense, my mind alert, and every sound in the house seemed to carry a hidden message. I kept glancing at the bedroom door, imagining scenarios, imagining confessions, imagining betrayal. Each possibility made my chest tighten, but I couldn't tear myself away from thinking about it. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath with me, waiting for something to break. I went to the bedroom finally, standing just outside the door, listening to the faint sounds of him breathing. The intimacy of the moment, the knowledge of someone I loved sleeping just feet away, felt suddenly dangerous. The sense of unease wasn't just emotional. It was physical, a prickling awareness that something was deeply wrong. I leaned against the doorframe, tracing the smooth wood with my fingertips, grounding myself, trying to calm my racing heart. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, hands clasped tightly, staring down at him. The sunlight hit the room in soft streaks, illuminating the familiar objects. Books on the nightstand, a coffee mug, a jacket draped over the chair, but they felt alien, imbued with tension. My mind wandered to Mrs. Reynolds' caution, to the possibility that the truth was closer than I wanted to admit. My chest ached, a mix of fear and anticipation, as I wondered what I would find if I dared to confront reality. By the time I returned to the kitchen, the house felt both familiar and threatening. The clink of dishes, the hum of appliances, even the faint ticking of the wall clock seemed heightened, charged with meaning. I realized that nothing would feel the same again. The sense of unease had taken root, a quiet, persistent tension that wouldn't lift with a cup of coffee or a few deep breaths. I could only move through the morning slowly, deliberately, each action tethering me to the reality of my own home while my mind raced ahead, bracing for whatever truth might emerge as I stood in the kitchen that morning. I couldn't help but think back to the early days of our marriage, the moments that had once felt unshakable. I remembered how we met, the way he had smiled at me across the crowded cafe, and the slow, steady pull that had drawn us together. Everything had felt effortless then. Conversations that lasted hours, laughter spilling into the quiet corners of our lives, and a sense that we were building something lasting. That memory now felt distant, like looking through a fogged window at a life that might no longer exist. I recalled our first apartment, tiny and cluttered but ours, filled with secondhand furniture and big dreams. The smell of fresh paint and takeout lingered in my memory, mingling with the nervous excitement of setting up a life together. I remembered late nights lying awake, talking about the future, imagining the house we would buy, the family we would grow. Back then, I had believed so completely in him, in us, in the promise of honesty and devotion. That belief now felt fragile, easily shattered by the gnawing doubt creeping into my mind that morning. Over the years, life had grown more complicated. Work obligations, bills, and responsibilities had taken a toll, but I had thought we were resilient. I remembered celebrating anniversaries with quiet dinners at home, the way he would look at me across the table as though I was the only person in the world, and I had felt safe, cherished. Those moments now felt bittersweet, tinged with the growing awareness that appearances could mask the truth, and that love, no matter how deep, didn't guarantee transparency. I started to replay small incidents in my mind, incidents I had brushed off as trivial at the time. The way he sometimes took calls in the garage, hushed and abrupt. The way he would leave his phone face down on the counter or change his tone when I walked into a room. I had smiled, reassured myself that everyone deserved a little privacy, that he had stress at work, or that I was being overly sensitive. But the haze of nostalgia that had once softened these moments had begun to lift, replaced by a cautious awareness. I thought about how much I had trusted him, how his reassurances had always calmed my anxieties. He had a way of speaking that made doubts feel irrational, that turned questions into guilt. I had admired that confidence, felt it as a security blanket, and now I wondered whether I had been blind to subtle cracks in that facade. My mind twisted over every memory, searching for inconsistencies I hadn't noticed before, trying to reconcile the husband I had loved with the man I suspected he might be. There had been tiny changes over time, details I had filed away without thought. The brief flinch when certain topics arose, the slightly evasive answers to simple questions, the occasional late nights working that never seemed to add up. Back then, I had dismissed them as normal, as the inevitable ebb and flow of long-term relationships. But now, each minor inconsistency loomed large, a shadow stretching over the foundation of trust one had assumed was solid. I thought about his laugh, the warmth of his hand in mine, the way he had once whispered reassurances when life felt overwhelming. Those memories were now bittersweet, tainted with uncertainty. Could the same man who had been tender and attentive also be hiding secrets so deep that my entire sense of home and security was in jeopardy? The thought made my stomach twist. I felt the sharp edge of betrayal even before I had confirmed anything. I tried to remember what had drawn me to him originally. His humor, his generosity, the way he made me feel seen in a world that often overlooked me. I wanted to hold onto those truths, to reconcile the past with the present. But the morning's phone call had thrown everything into question. Every memory felt fragile, like a thin layer of ice over water, and I feared it could break at any moment, plunging me into a reality I wasn't ready to face. The contrast between then and now made the house feel different, even familiar spaces like the living room and bedroom carrying new weight. I noticed the way the sunlight caught the edges of the furniture, highlighting details I had never paid attention to, and each one seemed to carry a hidden story. Even the faint smell of his cologne lingering in the air was a reminder that the man I thought I knew might not be the man I was living with anymore. I sat at the kitchen table, tracing the rim of my coffee cup with a fingertip, trying to steady the rush of emotions. Nostalgia and dread collided inside me, a strange mixture that made breathing feel deliberate and necessary. I wanted to trust my memories, to believe in the man I had married, but the uncertainty planted by the neighbor's call made it impossible. I felt a hollow ache, a sense of vulnerability that ran deeper than anything I had experienced in years. Even as I replayed moments of laughter and closeness, I couldn't ignore the gnawing questions. What was hidden from me? What had I missed? What did he want me not to see? The weight of these unspoken suspicions pressed down, making the air in the kitchen feel heavier than it should. I felt my fingers tighten around the mug, the warmth barely reaching my trembling hands, and I realized I was no longer just thinking about the past. I was bracing for what the present might reveal. It wasn't like the warning signs came all at once. They were subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like a barely audible creak in a floorboard that only certain ears could hear. I started noticing them months ago, small cracks in what I had believed was a solid, unshakable trust. My husband would sometimes answer my questions with vague responses, a pause that seemed normal at first but lingered just long enough to make me feel uncertain. The unease began as a whisper in the back of my mind and grew louder with every inconsistency. He had developed a habit of keeping his phone close at all times, which I hadn't thought much of initially. People get busy, I told myself. But the way he would snap it shut when I entered the room, the sudden shift in tone when a message arrived, it all started to feel deliberate. I remember one evening clearly. He had left the phone face down on the coffee table. Yet when I reached for it casually, he lunged slightly, insisting, "It's nothing really." The way his eyes darted made my stomach twist. That moment stayed with me, though I didn't fully understand why at the time. Other little behaviors began adding up. He would sometimes come home later than expected, citing work obligations that I couldn't verify. The smell of his cologne lingered differently on those nights, stronger, as though masking something else. I found myself paying more attention to the sounds of the house. The slam of the car door, the faint rustle of papers, the pattern of his footsteps in the hallway. Each detail felt like a clue, but I didn't yet know what puzzle I was trying to solve. Even daily routines started to feel off. He would sometimes make plans without mentioning them, then casually slip explanations afterward that didn't quite make sense. I remember the first time I realized I was paying attention in a new way. I had asked where he had been, and he responded vaguely, almost too casually. The ease of his words, the practiced calm, felt unnatural. It was as if I was seeing him for the first time in months, noticing that the man I thought I knew had a hidden layer I hadn't recognized. There were subtle emotional cues too. I noticed moments when he seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere, and the way his gaze would shift when I asked questions. A laugh that once seemed genuine now felt rehearsed. A gesture that once comforted me now made me uneasy. I began cataloging these incidents in my mind, trying to decide if I was imagining things or if my intuition was picking up something real. Each observation left a tiny ache in my chest, a tension that refused to fade. I also started noticing inconsistencies in his stories. Small details would change if I asked later, places he had supposedly gone, conversations he had supposedly had. At first, I brushed it off, thinking it was normal forgetfulness, but over time the patterns became too clear to ignore. There was a rhythm to the dishonesty, a precision that unnerved me more than any argument ever could. I realized I was no longer just living in the house. I was observing, analyzing, trying to understand someone I had trusted completely. Even the little things at home became significant. The placement of objects seemed different sometimes, as if he had moved things to obscure them or to avoid leaving evidence. A coat left in an unusual spot, the car parked slightly askew in the driveway, the faint scent of someone else in the air. All tiny signals that chipped away at the foundation of comfort I had once taken for granted. Each clue built a slow, creeping sense of unease that refused to leave. I found myself questioning not only his actions but my own perceptions. Was I imagining things? Was I being paranoid? Every time I tried to dismiss a worry, another subtle sign would appear to validate it. I felt trapped between disbelief and intuition, unsure of which to trust. That tension became a constant companion, following me through the house, settling on my shoulders, reminding me that something was deeply wrong. By the end of the morning, the unease had evolved into a quiet vigilance. I moved through our home differently now, eyes flicking toward doors and windows, ears straining for any unusual sounds. I could no longer allow myself the luxury of ignorance. Every small detail mattered. Every inconsistency demanded attention. I felt a weight in my chest, a combination of fear, frustration, and anticipation, as though the house itself held its breath with me, waiting for the truth to reveal itself. Even routine moments, like pouring a cup of coffee or opening the blinds, carried a subtle tension. The sunlight streaming in felt colder somehow, harsher, spotlighting every imperfection and every shadow. I felt like I was living in two realities at once. The one I had believed in, filled with love and trust, and this new one, where questions lingered in every corner and every sound could signal betrayal. It was exhausting and relentless, and yet, I couldn't turn away. The early warning signs, subtle and insidious, had changed me. I was no longer the person who could accept explanations at face value. I was alert, calculating, trying to understand what was hidden in plain sight. The sense of unease that morning had settled firmly in my chest, a quiet but persistent pulse reminding me that the life I thought I knew was shifting, and that I had to be ready for whatever truth lay ahead. Over the past few weeks, I had begun noticing subtle hints from people close to me, little nudges that something wasn't quite right. At first, I brushed them off as coincidence or my own overthinking. But the more they appeared, the harder it became to ignore them. My sister had casually mentioned one evening that she noticed my husband seemed distracted at our last family dinner, checking his phone more than usual. Her words were light, almost joking, but there was an undertone I couldn't ignore, a hesitation in her tone that suggested she was holding something back. A close friend had also dropped hints during a coffee meetup, speaking carefully as though testing the waters. I don't know if you've noticed, but, well, sometimes people aren't exactly what they seem, she said, her voice soft and almost apologetic. I had nodded, smiling weakly, pretending to understand while my stomach churned with an unexplainable unease. Every interaction now felt loaded with meaning, like I was piecing together a puzzle from fragments scattered in plain sight. Even casual conversations with neighbors started to feel heavy with implication. One afternoon, Mrs. Reynolds had asked me innocuously how my husband was doing, her eyes flicking briefly away. There was a strange weight to her gaze, as if she knew something I didn't and was struggling to decide whether to tell me. At first, I felt grateful for her concern, but soon it became unsettling. The feeling of someone silently warning me, without giving full details, left a cold tension in the air. Each of these hints created a ripple of anxiety inside me. I found myself recalling old conversations, trying to pinpoint times when others' words might have been signaling a hidden truth. I noticed my heart rate quicken whenever someone mentioned him casually, every compliment or passing comment suddenly taking on a double meaning. The comfort of friends and family, which I had always relied upon, now felt like a minefield. Each interaction was a delicate dance, a test of whether I could glean enough information without revealing my growing suspicions. I began keeping track of small inconsistencies I heard secondhand, the way people described his behavior differently from what he had told me. A friend might casually mention that he had been seen leaving late at night, or that someone had called him at odd hours. At the time, I had felt frustrated by the vagueness of these accounts, but now each detail began to stitch together a pattern I couldn't deny. My anxiety grew, tangled with the creeping certainty that something serious was happening behind my back. Even my parents, who lived a few states away, contributed to the growing unease. During a phone call, my mother casually remarked that she had noticed he seemed quieter than usual when we last visited. Her words were gentle, but there was a weight in them that made me pause, replaying our conversation long after the call ended. I couldn't tell if she was simply being observant or if she had sensed the same dissonance I had started to feel in the house, a tension that hovered just below the surface of our daily life. I started noticing patterns in the things people said, subtle overlaps and repeated phrases that hinted at deception. The way someone would hesitate before speaking, the slight lowering of their voice, the careful choice of words, all of it felt deliberate. I became hyper-aware, analyzing each interaction with the precision of someone piecing together evidence. What had once been casual chatter now carried a sense of urgency, and I realized that I couldn't ignore these hints any longer. The tension this created within me was relentless. Every friendly visit or casual conversation left me more alert, more watchful, and increasingly on edge. Even seemingly innocuous words like, "Are you sure he said that?" or "I could be wrong," but sent waves of doubt coursing through me. I found myself second-guessing everything he had told me, retracing his actions in my mind, and trying to discern patterns that might reveal the truth. By the end of the day, the hints from friends and family had solidified into a quiet resolve. I knew that something was happening that I wasn't yet fully aware of, but the repeated nudges had made it impossible to dismiss my instincts. I felt a mixture of apprehension, frustration, and determination. The seed of suspicion that had been planted months ago had grown into something far more tangible, a cautious, deliberate awareness that I needed to see the full picture for myself. Even though no one had outright told me the truth, the pieces were starting to fall into place. The subtle warnings, the half-spoken comments, the careful hints, all of them were pushing me toward a realization I wasn't yet ready to face. As I went to bed that night, the house was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the world around me had shifted. I felt both vulnerable and alert, bracing myself for what I knew I would eventually have to confront. I sat on the edge of the couch, my fingers tracing the seam of a pillow as if it might steady the shaking I felt. The room was dim except for a thin strip of morning light slipping between the curtains, and it made everything look softer than it felt. My phone lay face down on the coffee table, but every few seconds, I glanced at it anyway, like I expected it to come alive on its own. I could still hear Mrs. Halpern's voice echoing in my head, tight with worry, insisting that something about my husband's routine wasn't right. She wasn't usually dramatic, but today, she sounded terrified. I tried to take a breath, but it felt shallow and shaky. The silence in the house made my thoughts louder, bouncing around and pulling me into places I didn't want to go. I kept replaying the details she'd shared, searching for some logical explanation that didn't make me feel nauseous. Maybe she misheard him. Maybe she misunderstood the situation. Maybe she simply wanted someone to talk to. Even as I told myself those things, my chest tightened, because none of it truly made sense. The mug of coffee beside me smelled burnt now, untouched since I poured it. Its warmth had faded, but the bitter scent still sat in the air, reminding me that I'd been sitting in the same spot far too long. My hands felt cold, and I rubbed my palms together, trying to ground myself. The cushion under me felt uneven, as if I'd worn out the fabric with my restless shifting. I didn't know where to look. At the floor, at the window, anywhere but the thoughts crowding my mind. A sound from outside made me flinch. It was just a car door slamming down the street, but my nerves jumped like it was something urgent. I got up and walked toward the window, slowly pulling the curtain aside. The neighborhood looked normal, too normal, almost unsettlingly so. Kids' bikes on lawns, a dog barking distantly, someone rolling out a trash bin. The mundane scene felt like an insult to the storm inside my chest. Nothing out there suggested that my life might be shifting without my permission. Leaning my forehead against the cool glass, I tried to slow my breathing. The coolness helped a little, like dipping my thoughts into cold water. But then I remembered something. How my husband had left earlier than usual that morning. He'd kissed my forehead, barely awake, and told me not to worry about breakfast. I dismissed it at the time, thinking he wanted to get an early start. But now, with everything swirling in my head, the memory felt heavier. Why had he rushed? Why had he seemed distracted? I pulled back and let the curtain fall into place, swallowing hard as the room dimmed again. Part of me wanted to call him right then, confront him, demand answers. Another part of me wanted to wait, to gather more information, to avoid jumping to conclusions that might make me look ridiculous. I hated that I didn't trust myself enough to act. I hated even more that I didn't trust him right now. The air in the room felt thick, almost stale. I opened a window slightly, letting in a soft gust of cool morning air that carried the faint smell of cut grass. It brushed against my face, grounding me for a moment. I rested my hands on the window frame, feeling the smooth wood under my fingertips. The breeze rustled the side of the curtain, and the sound felt strangely soothing. I closed my eyes and let the draft cool my skin. But when I opened them again, my gaze fell on the small pile of receipts on the dining table. Receipts I'd been meaning to sort for weeks. One of them stuck out slightly, like it wanted attention. I walked over to it, my heartbeat suddenly quickening without knowing why. The paper felt stiff between my fingers as I pulled it free. It was from a gas station a few miles away, time-stamped late at night, a day he'd told me he was working late at the office. I remembered that night clearly. How exhausted he'd seemed, how he crashed into bed without saying much. I stared at the receipt longer than necessary, tracing the printed numbers with my thumb. It wasn't damning evidence. Not by itself. People stopped for gas all the time. But something about it unsettled me. It was like noticing a hairline crack in a window. You know it won't shatter immediately, but you also know it's not as solid as it used to be. My legs felt unsteady as I sat back down at the table. The chair creaked softly beneath me, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times. Yet today it felt sharper. I placed the receipt on the table in front of me, aligning it with the edges as if neatness could offer clarity. My mind raced back to the neighbor's shaky voice on the phone, how she said he'd been somewhere he shouldn't have been. Her words had felt intrusive then. Now they felt like a warning I couldn't ignore. I rubbed my temples, feeling a dull ache forming behind my eyes. Everything felt tangled, memories, suspicions, tiny details that suddenly felt significant. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I also couldn't pretend nothing was wrong. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in the background only made the silence more unsettling. I pressed my palms to the table, grounding myself against the smooth surface. Finally, I leaned back and let out a slow, shaky breath. The room didn't feel any different, but something inside me had shifted, a heaviness settling in a place I didn't want it. I didn't know what to do yet. I didn't know what to believe, but I knew I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore, no matter how much I wanted to. The morning light had grown a little brighter, stretching across the floor, and for a moment, I just watched it, letting the warmth touch my toes as I tried to calm the unease settling deep in my chest. It wasn't long after that morning that I began noticing things I hadn't before. Small, seemingly insignificant details that now felt loaded with meaning. My husband's phone had always been nearby, but suddenly it felt like a sealed vault. The way he would pick it up quickly when I entered the room, sliding it face down as though hiding something, made my stomach twist. At first, I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that everyone deserves a little privacy. But the tension in the way he moved, the subtle flicker of his eyes, told a different story. Then came the first message. I was reaching for a glass in the kitchen when his phone lit up on the counter, buzzing quietly. I froze as a text preview flashed on the screen. The words weren't explicit, just a few vague sentences, but they were enough to make my pulse spike. My fingers hovered over the device as though touching it could shatter something fragile. He had left the room for a moment, and my mind raced. Should I look? Should I wait? Every instinct screamed to uncover the truth, even though I feared what I might find. The messages themselves were short, almost coded, leaving more questions than answers. There were references to meetings, times, and places I didn't recognize. Each notification made my chest tighten. I felt like an intruder in my own life, peering through cracks I wasn't supposed to see. And yet, I couldn't stop myself. The small screen held a universe of possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Every beep, every vibration seemed to taunt me, reminding me that there were things hidden right under my nose. I began noticing patterns, subtle signals I hadn't paid attention to before. He would leave his email open for a split second, quickly minimizing it whenever I walked by. Notifications would pop up on his laptop, and he would immediately shut the screen with a speed that seemed practiced. Even the way he organized his keys and wallet had changed. Items no longer in the usual spots, as if he were preparing for something I wasn't supposed to see. These small details combined to create a web of suspicion I couldn't untangle. The tension became almost unbearable. I found myself checking every corner of the house in ways that felt obsessive, tracing movements, remembering conversations, replaying encounters. There were receipts I hadn't noticed before, notes tucked into pockets, even the faint scent of cologne on shirts that didn't smell familiar. Each discovery added weight to the gnawing realization that there were parts of his life I wasn't privy to, parts he had deliberately hidden. At night, the unease followed me to bed. I would lie awake, listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioner, imagining the messages I had glimpsed and what they might mean. The house felt too silent, almost complicit in the secrets being kept within its walls. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant car passing by, set my mind racing. I felt exposed, vulnerable, yet unable to look away from the puzzle forming around me. One afternoon, curiosity got the better of me. He had stepped out for a quick errand, and the living room was empty. I hesitated, heart hammering, and then, as though drawn by gravity, I reached for the laptop on the table. It was locked, as always, but I noticed a sticky note clinging to the side. A name, a date, a cryptic location. It wasn't anything I could fully decipher, but it was a clue, a breadcrumb I hadn't seen before. My hands shook as I touched it, the paper rough under my fingertips, and I felt a mix of fear and determination. The more I discovered, the more I realized that the small inconsistencies from the past months were connected. The late nights, the vague excuses, the subtle evasions, they weren't accidents or forgetfulness. They were deliberate, and the realization settled like ice in my stomach. I was living alongside someone who had carefully curated a secret life, one I had no idea how to confront. The weight of it pressed down, heavy and suffocating. Even as I tried to rationalize, to tell myself that maybe it wasn't as serious as it seemed, the evidence kept stacking up. Messages, notes, receipts, strange phone calls. It all pointed toward the same uncomfortable truth. And with each small discovery, my sense of safety at home eroded further. The man I thought I knew, the person I had trusted completely, was not who he appeared to be. By the end of that week, I was hyper-aware of every detail, every movement, every glance he cast in my direction. My home no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had become a stage, and I was slowly uncovering the hidden acts that had played out behind closed doors. The tension was relentless, a low hum in my chest that refused to leave. I knew that the hidden messages were only the beginning, that what I was discovering now was part of a much larger picture, one that I wasn't yet ready to face in its entirety. It started with a receipt, tucked between the pages of a magazine on the coffee table. I had noticed it earlier but only now felt compelled to pick it up, my fingers trembling slightly as I unfolded the crumpled paper. The date and location didn't match anything he had told me. A rush of cold realization swept over me, sharp and immediate, and I felt the room spin for a moment. The kitchen, so familiar just days ago, now felt alien, every corner filled with shadows I hadn't noticed before. I set the receipt down and stared at it, my mind racing through explanations. Maybe he had forgotten to tell me, maybe it was something innocent, but a creeping, insistent voice in my head whispered that it wasn't that simple. I could feel my pulse in my temples, loud and relentless, as the notion that this was part of a larger pattern began to sink in. Small cracks had been there for months, subtle hints I had brushed off, and now that crack had widened into a chasm I couldn't ignore. The next few days became an exercise in observation. I found myself noticing every minor inconsistency. The way he glanced at his phone when I entered a room, the faint smudge of dirt on his shoes that didn't belong to the driveway, the smell of coffee that didn't match the brand he always bought. Each small detail accumulated like stones, forming a mound of suspicion I couldn't step around. My heart thumped steadily in my chest, a constant reminder that nothing was as it seemed. I began retracing his steps mentally, replaying conversations, remembering slight evasions, and odd pauses in his speech. I felt a growing tension, a weight pressing down on my chest, making each breath deliberate. Even the ordinary sounds of the house, the creak of the stairs, the distant hum of traffic, the soft whir of the refrigerator, felt charged, as though they were signaling hidden truths I was only just beginning to understand. One evening, I noticed his jacket hanging differently than usual, the pockets slightly bulging in places that suggested more than keys and wallet. I reached for it, almost without thinking, feeling the rough fabric under my fingertips, and my pulse raced. The subtle detail was enough to confirm what I had begun suspecting. The cracks weren't random. They were deliberate signs of something hidden. My stomach turned at the thought, a mixture of fear and the grim resolve that I needed to know everything. I couldn't sleep for nights. Every creak in the house, every car door outside, made me flinch. I would lie awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of life continuing around me, oblivious to the storm inside my own home. I felt trapped between the desire to confront him and the need to gather more evidence, to ensure that when the truth came out, it would be undeniable. The tension gnawed at me, relentless, like a pulse of dread I couldn't ignore. The small details began forming patterns. Late-night trips, unusual phone activity, receipts from places I didn't recognize, all converging in my mind to create a picture I wasn't ready to face. Each discovery intensified the sense of betrayal, the realization that the trust one had placed in someone I loved had been violated. I felt a bitter mix of grief, anger, and determination, emotions that intertwined so tightly I could hardly breathe. Even ordinary routines became suspect. The way he poured coffee, how he handled the mail, the subtle adjustments he made to everyday tasks. All of it seemed calculated. It was exhausting to notice, to track, to catalog, but I couldn't help myself. My intuition screamed that every detail mattered, and ignoring them would leave me vulnerable. I was aware that the life I thought I had was slowly unraveling beneath my feet, and the deeper I looked, the more apparent it became. By the end of the week, what had been a small crack of suspicion had widened into an unmistakable divide. I realized I could no longer trust the version of reality I had been living. Every interaction, every glance, Every small gesture carried weight, and I felt the distance between us stretch further. The man I had known, the life I had built, and the home I had felt safe in. All of it now felt precarious, like standing on the edge of a cliff and seeing the ground fall away beneath me. I took a long, steadying breath, trying to calm the storm inside me. The tension had evolved from a whisper into a roar, but somewhere in the back of my mind, a resolve began to form. I knew I had to understand the full scope of what he was hiding. The chasm between us was real, and to bridge it or to survive it, I had to confront it with eyes wide open, no matter how painful the truth would be. The tension had been building for weeks, a constant hum in the back of my mind that I could no longer ignore. That evening, I decided I needed answers. I couldn't sit quietly any longer, pretending everything was normal while suspicion gnawed at me. The house felt heavier than usual, every shadow seeming to carry secrets, every ordinary sound amplified. My hands trembled slightly as I waited for him to return, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter as if it could anchor me. When he finally walked through the door, I noticed him immediately, the slight stiffness in his posture, the way his eyes flicked toward the phone on the counter before meeting mine. He smiled, the casual, effortless smile I had once trusted without question, and my chest tightened. Something about it felt rehearsed, calculated. I forced myself to take a deep breath, to steady my shaking hands, as I tried to keep my voice calm. "I need to talk to you," I said, the words simple, but weighted with months of unspoken suspicion. His smile faltered slightly, a tiny hesitation that made my pulse spike. He nodded slowly, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. Even in the familiar environment of our home, I felt as if we were stepping onto unfamiliar terrain. I could sense the tension radiating from him, subtle but undeniable, and I braced myself for whatever he was about to reveal or conceal. I started with the small details, testing the waters. Questions about receipts, late nights, and unexplained errands spilled from my lips, careful but probing. Each answer he gave was measured, precise, and yet something about the cadence of his voice didn't feel right. My intuition flared. I could feel the energy in the room shift. The man I had trusted completely was now a stranger I was forced to analyze, every gesture and tone scrutinized for hidden meaning. He deflected at first, smiling and explaining things in a way that felt rehearsed, like he had anticipated my concerns. My stomach churned, a mix of relief and growing frustration. Relief that nothing had yet been confirmed, frustration at the careful evasions that were impossible to ignore. Every small explanation seemed like a thin veil over a deeper truth, and my pulse quickened as I realized how much effort he had put into hiding parts of his life from me. The first real crack came when I asked about a specific night, a night he claimed to have worked late. I had the receipt, the timestamp, the location, all of it contradicting his story. For the first time, his calm demeanor faltered. His eyes shifted, a small tightening of the jaw, a micro-expression of something I hadn't seen before. That hesitation, barely noticeable but there, made my heart pound. I knew then that the cracks in our marriage were more than just subtle hints. They were undeniable. I pressed gently but firmly, not wanting to push too hard, but needing clarity. The house felt impossibly quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock the only background noise to the tension in the room. My chest felt tight, every breath deliberate, every word carefully chosen. I sensed that if I overstepped, he might retreat further into secrecy, and I couldn't let that happen. I needed the truth. Finally, he paused in a way that made my stomach twist. He looked down at his hands, then back at me, and there was an honesty there I hadn't seen in months. Not the full truth, not yet, but a crack in the armor. A subtle admission that something had been hidden, and that I was closer to discovering it than he had anticipated. I felt a surge of both fear and determination, knowing that the confrontation had begun, and that nothing would ever be the same again. By the time the conversation ended that evening, nothing had been fully revealed, yet everything had shifted. I was no longer in the dark. The careful balance of everyday life, the sense of security I had taken for granted, had been disrupted. I felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve, knowing that the path ahead would be difficult, that there were more truths to uncover, and that the man I loved or thought I loved was not entirely the person I had believed him to be. Even as he left the room, the tension lingered, a heavy presence that made ordinary objects seem charged with meaning. I sat back down on the couch, tracing the fabric with my fingers, and felt both fear and anticipation intertwining. This first confrontation had opened the door, revealing glimpses of hidden truths. And though I didn't yet know the full extent of the betrayal, I understood one thing clearly. The life I had known was changing, and I was no longer a passive observer. After that first confrontation, the air in the house felt heavier, almost suffocating. Every room I entered seemed charged with tension, each ordinary sound magnified. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the stairs, the faint rustle of papers on the counter. My mind was constantly on alert, scanning for inconsistencies, replaying conversations, searching for signs I might have missed before. The calm that had once existed in our home was gone, replaced by a low, persistent hum of anxiety. I began noticing patterns in his behavior that I hadn't before. He started taking longer showers, closing the bathroom door more firmly, and locking it occasionally. The subtle shifts in routine, which might have seemed trivial to anyone else, felt deliberate to me. My stomach tightened each time I walked by and saw him emerge, dripping water and slightly flushed, pretending as if everything were normal. The smallest details, like a change in tone or a pause before answering, became red flags, impossible to ignore. Even mundane tasks carried weight now. The way he would handle mail, the casual glances he gave at his phone when I was nearby, and the way he sometimes avoided eye contact. All of it started forming a pattern I couldn't dismiss. I cataloged everything in my mind, silently taking note of each deviation from his usual behavior. My trust in him had fractured, and I realized that intuition alone would not suffice. I needed concrete evidence to reconcile the person I loved with the one I now suspected was hiding something. Late one evening, I overheard a phone call. He thought I was asleep, his voice low and guarded, the words clipped and deliberate. I couldn't make out everything, but certain phrases stood out. A location I didn't recognize, times that contradicted what he had told me, references to meetings that I hadn't known about. My hands shook as I listened from the doorway, heart hammering, stomach twisting in knots. The unease that had been building over months now felt unavoidable, like a storm breaking over the horizon. I began following subtle cues more actively, noticing his movements and routines with a precision I hadn't thought possible. When he left for errands, I watched him disappear down the street, sometimes noting a stop at places he hadn't mentioned. I didn't confront him immediately. I needed to observe, to gather information without tipping him off. The tension of living alongside someone whose actions no longer aligned with their words was relentless, gnawing at every quiet moment. Friends and family continued to drop hints, seemingly unconsciously, about what they had noticed. A passing remark about him leaving the house late, or how he seemed distracted, now carried a weight that made my chest tighten. Each conversation added pieces to a puzzle that I hadn't been able to assemble before. The patterns were becoming undeniable. The man I had trusted completely was concealing something significant. I also started noticing changes in how he interacted with me. Simple gestures, like lingering touches or smiles, sometimes felt genuine, and other times forced, rehearsed. The ambiguity made me anxious, uncertain of what to believe. I caught myself analyzing every inflection, every blink, every hesitation, desperate to decipher what was real and what was fabricated. The emotional strain was exhausting, but I couldn't afford to ignore it. Even the environment seemed to reflect the growing tension. The house felt smaller, each room crowded with invisible weight. I would sit at the kitchen table, tracing the patterns in the wood, the familiar surfaces suddenly foreign. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and I became acutely aware of how quiet the world could feel when your trust had been compromised. The mundane became charged with meaning, every object a potential clue, every sound a signal. By the end of the week, my vigilance had reached a fever pitch. I couldn't relax, couldn't let my guard down, even for a moment. The cracks in our marriage had widened into something tangible, a tension that filled the rooms and followed me wherever I went. I felt the weight of betrayal pressing on my chest, a persistent ache that refused to fade. And yet, alongside the fear, there was a resolve growing stronger. I needed to uncover the full truth, no matter how painful it might be. The escalation of suspicion had changed me fundamentally. I was no longer naive, no longer willing to take his words at face value. Every interaction, every observation, every hint carried significance, and I knew I had to navigate this delicate balance carefully. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with emotional peril, but I understood one thing clearly. I could no longer live in ignorance. I needed to know exactly what was hidden behind the man I thought I knew. The moment I discovered the truth felt like the room had suddenly shifted around me. It began with a folder I hadn't noticed before, tucked behind a stack of old bills in his office. The papers inside were neatly organized, but the content was anything but ordinary. There were receipts, bank statements, and a series of documents that confirmed every suspicion I had been quietly nursing for months. My hands shook as I sifted through them, each piece of evidence a key unlocking a door I hadn't been ready to open. It wasn't just the financial records that struck me. There were messages, correspondences, and notes that painted a picture of a life I had never known. People, places, events, all hidden in plain sight, carefully concealed beneath the routine of our everyday life. I felt a rush of disbelief, anger, and sorrow all at once. The man I had trusted implicitly had built a parallel world, and for the first time I could see it in its entirety. The weight of betrayal pressed down on me, heavier than I could have imagined. I replayed every interaction I had with him in recent months, realizing now how meticulously he had crafted his facade. Each late night, each vague explanation, each carefully timed errand. They were all part of a pattern I had struggled to see until now. The clarity was painful, but it was also strangely liberating. I could finally connect the dots, understand the inconsistencies, and confirm what my instincts had been telling me all along. The emotions hit me in waves. There was rage at the deceit, sorrow for the trust that had been shattered, and a deep, gnawing sense of loss for the life I had thought I knew. I could feel my chest tighten, my stomach twist, and tears prickling my eyes as the reality settled in. Every familiar corner of the house, every shared memory, suddenly carried a layer of duplicity I hadn't been able to perceive before. Even the soft hum of the air conditioner seemed louder, a reminder that nothing would ever feel the same. I took a moment to breathe, to steady myself against the shock. The evidence was clear, irrefutable, and it left me with a decision: how to proceed. I knew I had to be careful, deliberate, and strategic. There was no room for confrontation fueled by emotion alone. I needed to understand fully, to know everything, and to plan my next steps with precision. The moment of revelation was just the beginning. What came next would define the rest of my life. As I continued to sift through the documents, more details emerged that deepened my understanding of his duplicity. Names I didn't recognize, addresses that had never been mentioned, and transactions that contradicted everything he had told me. The depth of the deception was staggering. It wasn't simply a series of small lies. It was an entire life carefully concealed, running parallel to the one I thought we shared. The realization made my stomach churn and my hands tremble, but I also felt a strange sense of clarity. I remembered the subtle hints I had noticed for months. The evasive phone calls, the strange receipts, the minor inconsistencies in his stories. All of them were now part of a coherent narrative, evidence of a life he had hidden deliberately. My feelings of doubt and suspicion, which had once made me question my own perceptions, were now validated. I could finally see the full picture, and though it was devastating, it also empowered me with knowledge I hadn't had before. Even as I absorbed the truth, I felt a mixture of fear and resolve. I realized that my life would never return to what it had been. The trust we had built was shattered, but with that revelation came the opportunity to reclaim control. I had the facts, the evidence, and the clarity I needed to make deliberate decisions. The emotional impact was intense, but I understood that knowledge was power, and that I could now navigate the situation with purpose rather than blind hope. By the time I set the documents down, I felt exhausted, drained, and strangely focused. The storm of emotions, anger, grief, disbelief, was still there, but so was a sense of determination. The truth, hidden for so long, had finally been revealed. I knew that the next steps would be crucial, that every move needed careful thought, and that the man I had once trusted completely had finally been unmasked. And though the pain was sharp, I also felt a spark of empowerment. Now I knew, and knowledge would guide my path forward. Even after uncovering the hidden truth, the sense of betrayal deepened in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just that he had been hiding a parallel life from me. It was the realization that he had deliberately involved people I trusted, weaving a web of deception that extended beyond our home. Friends, colleagues, and even neighbors who had seemed ordinary now appeared as unwitting participants or silent witnesses to the lie. The weight of this realization pressed down on me, heavier than the initial discovery. I replayed the past months, remembering conversations that now felt tainted. Casual comments from friends suddenly seemed like half-truths or veiled warnings. Family gatherings, dinners, and ordinary interactions all carried layers I had been too blind to notice at the time. I felt anger not just at him, but at the sheer audacity of the betrayal. The person I had loved, shared a home with, and trusted implicitly had meticulously orchestrated a double life, and it had gone on right under my nose. The emotional impact was overwhelming. My chest ached, my stomach twisted, and my mind raced with questions I didn't have answers to. How long had this been going on? What had he been thinking? Did he ever feel guilt, or was this deception part of his nature? The questions swirled relentlessly, leaving me breathless and on edge. I could feel my hands trembling as I thought about the trust one had invested so completely, only to have it systematically undermined. I began to notice subtle patterns of manipulation I had previously overlooked. The carefully timed messages, the evasive explanations, the selective sharing of information. All of it was designed to maintain the illusion. The man I thought I knew had been practicing his deception for months, maybe years, and I had been unknowingly complicit in it simply by trusting him. The sense of violation was intense, like the ground beneath me had shifted, leaving me unsteady and exposed. Even ordinary items in the house now seemed suspect. Receipts, notes, and personal effects that had once felt mundane were now evidence of the hidden life he had led. Every corner of our home seemed to carry traces of deception, subtle reminders of a truth I had only just begun to comprehend. The space I had considered safe, familiar, and shared was suddenly alien, filled with shadows of things I wasn't meant to see. The realization of the ultimate betrayal sparked a mixture of fear and clarity. I understood that I could no longer ignore the signs, that I had to confront the situation with careful deliberation. My emotions were raw, anger, sadness, disbelief. But beneath it all, a thread of determination emerged. I needed to reclaim control not with rash action, but with measured steps that would allow me to navigate the situation intelligently and protect myself. I started mapping everything in my mind, cataloging the lies, the inconsistencies, and the evidence I had uncovered. It was like building a blueprint of his deception piece by piece. Each fact, each receipt, each message added to the picture, revealing a level of premeditation I hadn't anticipated. The extent of the betrayal was staggering, but it also gave me power, the knowledge that I now held the full story. Sleep became nearly impossible. Nights were filled with endless replaying of events, the patterns of deceit running on a loop in my mind. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, even the distant bark of a dog. My thoughts were relentless, a mixture of rage and calculated focus. I knew I had to remain composed, to act with intelligence rather than emotion, even as the sense of violation cut deep. By the end of that week, the magnitude of the betrayal had fully settled in. I understood that this was not a minor deception but a carefully constructed lie that had touched every part of my life. The person I had trusted had been living a parallel existence, manipulating circumstances, and concealing the truth. The emotional impact was immense, but so was my resolve. I knew that this was a turning point, a moment that would define the actions I would take next. Though I felt raw, exposed, and violated, there was also a clarity I hadn't experienced before. The ultimate betrayal had stripped away illusions, leaving only facts and evidence. I realized that the path forward required patience, strategy, and careful planning. I couldn't undo the deception, but I could control how I responded. And in that realization, I found a quiet, simmering strength, a sense that despite everything, I would navigate this betrayal with intelligence, not impulsiveness. After the truth had settled like a heavy weight in my chest, I knew that acting impulsively would accomplish nothing. I needed a plan, one that relied on patience and precision rather than confrontation or anger. The first step was reclaiming control over my own space and mind. I began organizing my environment carefully, taking note of all the evidence I had gathered, storing it where it could not be tampered with. Each document, receipt, and note became a tool, a piece of leverage that I could use to ensure the truth would be undeniable. I also started observing him with a new kind of attention. Every movement, every word, every interaction became a way to understand the depth of his deception and the limits of his awareness. I wasn't spying for curiosity's sake. I was gathering information to protect myself, to assert control over a situation that had previously left me powerless. The tension in the house remained, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was focused, purposeful, and strategic. I realized that quiet justice didn't need to be dramatic. It didn't require shouting, public exposure, or recklessness. It required patience, intelligence, and timing. I began taking steps to secure my own independence, subtly separating finances, organizing personal affairs, and documenting everything meticulously. Each action was deliberate, a way to ensure that I could navigate whatever came next without relying on trust that had been broken. I felt a strange empowerment in the process, as though the chaos of betrayal was slowly being transformed into something I could control. At the same time, I allowed myself moments of reflection. I acknowledged the pain, the heartbreak, and the violation I had experienced. I let myself feel anger, but I didn't act on it blindly. Instead, I channeled it into focus, a driving force that kept me vigilant and determined. Every choice, every observation, every small action was part of a larger strategy, one designed to restore balance and assert the truth without unnecessary harm. I also began to see the subtle ways he had underestimated me. He had assumed that his careful concealment would keep me in the dark indefinitely, that my trust would blind me to inconsistencies. But I had learned to read between the lines, to notice patterns and subtle signs, and now that knowledge became my advantage. I no longer reacted out of fear or confusion. I acted deliberately, calculating each step with precision and purpose. Small victories emerged quietly. A lie caught in the act, a contradiction revealed through documentation, a subtle acknowledgement of what he could no longer hide. Each of these moments reinforced my confidence and strengthened my resolve. I didn't need drama to assert justice. I only needed evidence, clarity, and patience. The quiet power of knowledge was far more effective than any impulsive action could have been. In the midst of this, I also nurtured my own resilience. I spent time alone, grounding myself in the routines and spaces I controlled. The house, once a source of anxiety and suspicion, became a place of strategy and reflection. I reminded myself that justice didn't have to be explosive. It could be intelligent, measured, and effective. Each choice I made reinforced that principle, turning betrayal into a lesson in foresight and patience. By the end of the month, a sense of calm authority had begun to replace the fear and tension. I had established boundaries, documented evidence, and observed him carefully, all while maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy. The quiet justice I was enacting didn't rely on anger or confrontation. It relied on strategy, intellect, and the certainty of truth. Every careful action I took was a step toward reclaiming my life, my autonomy, and my peace of mind. I realized that this form of justice was far more powerful than I had imagined. It didn't require spectacle or revenge in the traditional sense. It required intelligence, restraint, and timing. And as I moved forward, quietly asserting control, I felt a profound sense of clarity. The betrayal no longer held power over me. I had transformed it into a tool, a means to restore balance, and to ensure that truth would prevail, even in the quiet of the house. As I moved through ordinary tasks with deliberate care, I felt the weight of empowerment. The deception that had once dominated my life had been exposed, analyzed, and countered with precision. I knew that I had enacted justice without unnecessary drama or confrontation, relying solely on strategy, patience, and clarity. And in that quiet empowerment, I found a sense of peace that no betrayal could take away. By the time everything had settled, I found myself sitting quietly in the living room, the morning light filtering softly through the curtains. The house felt different now. Not empty, not tense, but measured and calm. I had taken control of the situation, and though the scars of betrayal remained, they were no longer paralyzing. The storm of deception had passed, leaving behind a clear landscape of truth, and I could finally begin to think about what came next. The weeks that followed were filled with reflection. I thought about the months I had lived with subtle lies, the ways I had ignored the small signs, and the lessons they taught me. I realized that trust, once broken, is both fragile and revealing. It shows you who people truly are and forces you to confront uncomfortable realities. I had been blindsided, yes, but I had also grown stronger, more perceptive, and more capable of protecting myself. I reflected on my own resilience. The fear, anxiety, and heartbreak had been intense, but I had endured them. I had learned to observe, to question, to analyze without losing my composure. In a strange way, the experience had sharpened me, teaching me patience and strategic thinking I hadn't known I possessed. It was empowering to recognize that I could navigate betrayal without losing my sense of self. At the same time, I acknowledged the emotional cost. The house I had once associated with warmth and safety had been transformed in my mind by deception and lies. Relationships I had assumed were solid now required careful reevaluation. I allowed myself to grieve, not just for the betrayal, but for the innocence and trust that had been lost. It was necessary to honor those feelings in order to move forward fully. I also thought about the man I had trusted, the one who had hidden so much from me. There was anger, certainly, but also a recognition of how carefully he had crafted his life without my knowledge. I understood that the betrayal reflected his choices and priorities, not my shortcomings. It was a lesson in discernment, teaching me to observe more keenly, to trust wisely, and to value evidence over assumption. In practical terms, I began rebuilding my life with intentionality. Boundaries were reinforced, personal accounts secured, and decisions made based on clarity rather than emotion. Every choice was deliberate, informed by the knowledge I had gained. I felt a renewed sense of agency, the understanding that while I could not control the past, I could shape my future with intelligence and purpose. Emotionally, I found a quiet sense of peace. I no longer felt the constant anxiety that had dominated my days. The tension in the house had lifted, replaced by measured awareness. I could move through my daily life with clarity, carrying the lessons of betrayal as both a caution and a source of strength. The past remained, of course, but it no longer dictated my emotions or actions. I also reflected on the importance of vigilance in relationships. Trust is valuable, but it should not blind you to reality. Subtle inconsistencies, small evasions, and the faintest traces of secrecy can be indicators that something deeper is at play. Learning to observe, question, and analyze without succumbing to paranoia had been a key survival skill. I recognized now that emotional intelligence is as crucial as instinct in navigating deception. Ultimately, I realized that moving forward meant living intentionally. I could not erase the past, but I could ensure that my future was guided by clarity, self-respect, and prudence. The betrayal had been profound, yet it had also illuminated my inner strength and capacity for strategy. I carried those lessons with me, ready to rebuild trust cautiously, and to ensure that my life would no longer be undermined by hidden truths. As I looked around the house that evening, the rooms bathed in soft golden light, I felt a sense of quiet resolution. The journey through deception and betrayal had been harrowing, but it had also been transformative. I had survived, learned, and reclaimed control. The lessons were indelibly etched into my mind and heart, guiding me toward a future where awareness, strategy, and self-respect would ensure that I would never again be blindsided in the same way. And in that quiet, steady calm, I finally felt whole again. I end this story. We learned that trust is precious but fragile, and even the people we think we know best can sometimes hide parts of themselves. We also saw the power of patience, observation, and intelligence when facing betrayal. Reacting with strategy rather than anger can help us reclaim control and protect ourselves. Most importantly, the story reminds us to listen to our instincts, pay attention to small signs, and never ignore the truth, even when it's painful. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever felt the sting of betrayal or the weight of secrets in someone you trusted, please take a moment to show your support. Hit that like button. It lets me know you're here listening and that these stories matter. Drop a comment and share your thoughts or experiences. Sometimes just talking about it makes the pain a little lighter. And if you want to follow me as I uncover more stories of hidden truths, deception, and resilience, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that could open your eyes and touch your heart.